Lab 5, we were talking about Socket.io. That's right, we were talking about how to build this chat application using this neat little library. And the exercise in the lab was to use node networking and Socket.io. Basically, a quick little introduction to Socket.io and how to get started on that. There was some starter code that you were going to use to to generate this little web page here that has a connect, disconnect, and send message, and how we were going to set up Socket.io on the client side, HTML page, and then have the Node.js server listing for events. So we wanted the server to set up a listener event for any new socket, any new connections coming in, and log it to the console. Set up a listener for sockets disconnecting and log it to the console on the server side. And then if there's any message coming back and forth, log that. On the client, we wanted to wire up connect button and wire up all those buttons to actually emit the events so that we're actually sending them down. That was just kind of getting used to the library and seeing the interaction between the server and the client. So we actually have this little interface. And again, if you don't know, you can use the console log tools, which we will in a second. So let's just close this out, and we have our server. So if we can see our panel here on the bottom here, let me run the terminal window, and we have this terminal window here, and we are we're looking at something else here. That is somebody else's work there. I was looking at technical difficulties here. I'm on live. I'm live in the I am live, and this is what happens when you're actually recording in one take, right? You get some technical difficulties here. Maybe I'll erase that. Maybe not. I'll just leave it in. Anyhow, so we have this interface here. We have the server running in the back. So if we're connecting here, and if it's running, let's see if it's running. We're disconnecting. Now we're connecting back. We're sending a message. Are we sending the message? Let's go, guys. All right, so it was a little delayed there. For some reason, I guess it was a port was tied up. So we can say send message. All right, send. Now it's responsive now. Okay, we can connect. So we already connected. We disconnect. We connect. Connection accepted. Send the message across the channel. All right, so we know that it's going back and forth. So we have the functionality that we wanted. Let's just quickly take a look at what we did. So on the server side, we have this. This is the index, sorry, server.js inside of our node modules. And if you don't remember, if you were just joining us, what we had to do was go to npm install on the command line socket.io, and inside our package.json we'll have it as a dependency socket.io at this version number. And then we need to, in our code that we had, we needed to go and include it. So we need to require it. So now we require socket.io. We set it to a variable called io. Now it is available to us to open up a channel, an FTP channel, sorry, not FTP, a TCP IP channel, and create a WebSocket, because we're dealing with WebSockets here. For those of you that don't know what a WebSocket is, it's a communication protocol. It's a channel that opens up that you can actually maintain that while you're connected, both client and server, and you can send messages across there. And it's much more reliable than, say, HTTP polling or kind of these kind of things. It's real time. You can sense presence, all that stuff. So anyhow, that's a little refresher on that. So we are actually using the HTTP module here just to explain the code, and we are firing up a web server, which is fantastic in this little bit of line of code. We are using we're not using a template engine here. If you notice, it's doing a little bit differently. It's using something called the file system module. And the file system module, what it's doing is that when it gets the root path, the file system is going to read a file called index.html. It's going to read it in a stream, and which is internal to Node.js. It knows what to do. It's going to grab all that HTML, and then it's going to set the header to 200, the content type to to HTML, and it's going to write that data under UDF format, and it's going to end the response. So that's a different way of doing it. You can use a template engine called EJS that does something differently. It renders view from the server side. this is sending this in the HTTP request. So, and it's not using Express. If you notice, it's not using Express at all. It's using the native node.js, which is perfectly fine. You don't need to use Express for building the chat application. You can do it in this way. You're just returning an interface back to the client. So that's what that code does. Sets up the server to listen. It listens on that port to 8080. And now we had this initial line here where we said socket.io, I choose you. So this is saying that. Again, you can use constant here, but by default we said var. So we're setting a listener up, a socket.io listener up on the server. So the server now is opened up on 8080, and now we are also listening on the TCP IP layer. So the server is listening for HTTP requests and responses, and then remember that protocol is at the top, and TCP IP is an underlying layer that that HTTP works above, right? Look at your networking diagram and see the different layers of networking, and you'll see that you'll see where these are in that diagram. So anyhow, what we did is we left this blank to go and fill out. So really, it's not too much code. Pretty much, we on the main socket.io, we go and we create a connection, right? So basically, what this is saying is when and across the whole channel, say IO is the channel, whenever there's a connection on the channel, we're going to do a callback function called, and I renamed this from client because a client could be coming in. I renamed it to socket. So when the client is establishing a new socket on the channel, there's a callback function that says, okay, I could very simply just say new client or new socket established on the connection, on the channel. So then we go up and we say connection accepted. So that's the first thing. If somebody joins again, you can have multiple browsers, clients joining the socket, and then you could have, say, multiple users on there. So just at the base level, it'll just connect and say connection accepted. But we wanted to do a little bit more. So we created a listener, event listener on the socket. Now this is a socket. When he disconnects from the channel, it's going to capture that. It's going to capture that if the client admits that he is disconnected or he leaves. It's smart enough to know if the browser closes out. This will get triggered and it just says disconnecting. So we have a connection and we have a disconnect. And then what we do is we have another listener on the socket. Again, this is the client. The individual socket is sending a message across the channel. So a listener is going to trigger when the named event message gets fired or emitted from the client. And it has a callback function. The callback function takes the message parameter, the data, and it console logs it, and then it emits that back up to the client that message was received. So we got that kind of communication going back and forth. That's the server side. And again, the console log is going to show up in this console log here. And if you notice, NodeMon is running. NodeMon is a monitoring tool, so we don't have to keep, canceling out of this and running Node. NodeMon is a monitoring tool. So on our client, that's returned is the index.html, which is the markup. So the only difference here that if you wanted to add socket.io, you would include this script tag to your HTML page, and that gives you the library, again, the same API, but the library is now for the client. So it has the same simple API, but now it's available on the client side. Again, we mentioned that it was already set up with jQuery, and the only jQuery really that was here was the document ready, which fires when the web page is ready. And we console log it was ready. And we had to go and add all of this stuff. So what we did is we created the socket as a global variable inside of our script scope, which is very small, which means now we can work with it. So when we want to, the page loads up, we make a connection back to the server saying connect. When that's triggered, our server gets triggered here. Our server message here gets triggered on connection, and we go through all of the setup. That's the initial step. Browser loads, we fire the connect, it catches it on the server side, it wires up all these events, and it doesn't do anything else. It doesn't send a message back up. So then we need to wire up some messages on our side. So we actually go through and we actually add socket dot socket.connect, socket.disconnect, socket.message received, and we console log it on the server side, and we alert it as well. I'm looking at the wrong file, by the way, so that was something I wanted to show you in a little bit. I'm going to look at this one here. So there's a little bit more scaled down. So we set up our listeners. Now when the server sends, it's listening for those, it'll console log it. And then if a server sends a message back up, it's going to say message received. And what that means is if you actually go to your, if we're looking at this here, and you go to console, you go to F12 to developer tools, and you have this console log tab here. You can see server connected, disconnected, server connected, disconnected, right? When we send the message, we actually have it prominent as an alert, but we should maybe change it to console log just so we can see all the messaging here. But if we don't have developer tools open, we wouldn't know any of this is happening. It might seem like the application is not working because nothing's happening. But that's what happens when you console log in the browser. It goes here. Console log on the server side goes in this bottom panel here. And that's how we're sending messages in this very basic level. So we set up these JavaScript functions here. And we wired them up to the buttons. So we have the 3 buttons here. On click, connect. On click of the disconnect, we call the disconnect function. And on send, we call this send function as well. So, and when in the handler, it's basically on connect is socket.connect, disconnect, socket.disconnect, and then socket.send. So we send that message back there, and then in the server side, on any of these events that happened, on disconnect, it knows what disconnect is internally. Hold on here, I'm jumping ahead, my mistake, don't want to confuse you there. On disconnect, it grabs the disconnect, and on message, it grabs the message parameter that's coming across. It could be called params, it could be whatever you want. It could be an object where we're just passing a string, we're console logging it, and then we're emitting back up that we received the message. And on the client side, on this handler, when it receives the message here, it'll trigger this callback, and the callback function is just an alert. And if you notice, we didn't use ES6 syntax with the arrow function. We probably should have, but we didn't, so we may need to change that. Anyhow, that was the exercise, that was the lab. I'm going to pause it right here, and I'm going to actually take it a step further because I said I would. I was going to show you how to, in this small example, just use namespaces and use rooms. So what I want to do is I want to create a private room. What am I doing here? I'm sorry, I'm going ahead of myself here. Here we go. Look at this part here. Before I'm jumping ahead here, this is what the code looks like at this current point. What I want to do is I want to add some more functionality to add 3 more buttons to simulate a private chat, and I'll just get set up in a second, and I'll just come right back. All right, so I wanted to create simulate a little bit of a private chat using rooms. So we kind of extended this a little bit because it's important to know how the rooms work, because you could build an interface where you have some type of way of selecting different rooms. If you wanted to have a private chat, a random general chat, you wanted to have different kind of namespaces, you can expand this out a little bit further, like we showed the Walking Dead demo, where you actually had different chat rooms you could do that went back to the TV show and all this kind of things. You can actually change users and all that stuff. The point of this is I want to have a general chat, which is the general channel, and then I join a room, which is private, and the socket has a name to it. So we would hope in a private chat that if we're sending messages privately, that the general room should not be able to get it, and that's basically what we're trying to do here. So we're all set up here, and we are connected on the main thread. Hopefully we're both connected here. If we send a message to the general room, we have a general room. It's not broadcasting correctly, but we know we're in the general room. So when I join the private chat, it's going to say welcome to private chat. So now I know that this guy on the left is in the private chat room. This user, guy or girl on the right side is he's in the general room still. So when I'm sending private messages here, he's not getting them. It says private message received. It should, whatever I put should be sent. So he's not getting them. So when I join this private chat channel here, so if I join here, He's going to get welcome to private chat. He got welcome to private chat. So I could have said user entered the room or whatever, what have you. So now we're both on the same channel. So if I send a message here, he'll get the message private, message received. I also got an echo. We basically broadcast it to everybody in the room, including myself. That's probably not the best experience, especially you don't want to see your own message. Well, I guess you would, right? You want to see the thread. Okay, so this guy sends another message back, and then he's going to leave. So he left. So now he's back on the general channel. If he triggers this general channel, I should not see it. Let's cross our fingers here. All right. So he's on the general channel. I don't see it. So when he joins back in, I mean, I can clear this out again. I'll clear this. If this is the console log here, you can actually clear your console. Clear console. Left guy's on the general channel. I'm on the private channel. I'm going to join. This guy joined. Now we can talk to each other. And he can send another message back. You can see it's incrementing the 2 every time I'm clicking it. 3, 4, 5. On this side, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to leave. He says I left. He's still in the private chat, and then when he leaves as well, now we're both in the main chat, and we can just disconnect and leave and disconnect. Server disconnected. Now we're out. So that was kind of a little show and tell of how you can make a private chat from the browser perspective. Now let's see what I did on the server side. Let's take a look. So what I did on the server side is I added a bit more to this, and I expanded this a little bit out. Inside of the same channel connection, I added some more listeners. I added something called join. And here's the trick here. Okay, I console log it, and then I use something called socket.join. So socket.join, and you give it a namespace. Now I'm hard coding this, and that maybe if you just wanted to show 2 rooms, you could do the same. Some other projects I've seen where they have a list and they pass back the name and multiple namespaces, and you can select what room you want to go into. For our little task that we want to do and build a chat room, this is fine. Something like this might be fine too. General and private, that's fine. Anyhow, we're doing socket.join private, and then we are send a message to the socket saying welcome to the private chat. So that's to myself, right? And actually, I don't know if this was actually triggered or not. I'd have to look. Maybe that was something that that I didn't wire up. But the main point is this: when you actually have socket.emit, you're talking to the user that connected only, that one socket, not everybody. If you want to broadcast to the entire room, here's the thing: is what you need to do. You need to go channel, which is io.to. So that is to that name, that room, and emit to everybody. You have to remember that you're sending the name event, but you got to remember that distinction there. That's important. This is to the one client who's connected, and then io.to room is to everybody. And that is, if you don't get that, I actually was looking at another piece of code where they didn't get this part. They tried to use of or io of or something like that. It didn't work. So they had rooms for every color of the rainbow, which was like I don't know, however many the guy put there. The group put like maybe 8 colors, and then they copy pasted per room the same code over and over and over, like 8 times: join, leaving, and all this stuff. That I have a very basic um, example, but they had a lot of code, and their main file was over like 2,000 lines of code because they didn't get the part. They missed it. io.to room, and then you can do it all in one spot. If you actually pass this name as a value, as a parameter in the function, and then you have it reusable and dynamic so that you can change rooms whenever the client is changing. Again, it's the caller, it's the socket, and he can change namespaces and go into any namespace, which is a room on that main channel. So that's what that is. So we set up the join, and that does what it says it does. It broadcasts everybody. The users enter the private chat. I have another one on socket.leave. When he leaves, a callback, console log it, and then there is an actual method on it saying leave. So it disconnects that socket from that room and goes back to the default, which is the general. You can actually do switch, socket.switch, I believe, I believe you can do socket.switch, or you might have to do leave the old room and join the new one. I think maybe that's how you do it. And again, broadcast to the entire room that the user has left, the private chat. And then I just on the socket, right? I send, when he's sending a private message, you have to remember, and I'm hard coding to everybody in the private room that this is the message sent. And I'm emitting back up to the client, and the client has emitters. So everybody who is on that channel, they have the emitters on the client side, and they're going to console log it. So the point to take away here is that there's the socket, who is the client, and if you want to broadcast to everybody, it's io.to name and emit, and you have to know socket.join name room and socket.leave name room. So those are the main things, and aside from that, the pattern is the same. In the index.html, we went and we added, so no change here, we just added 3 new listeners for the connected socket on the client side. Remember what that looks like. Remember what the, if I can bring up that, give me a second, I'll bring that diagram up. 1 second. This diagram right here, we might as well talk about, because we're talking about the handshaking that happens, right? The connection is open on the server side. There's this channel that opens up with bidirectional messages, and it's persistent. And then one side closes, or they both close disconnected. So when we are dealing with the socket and emitting to everybody across this channel, it's going to multiple clients, but anybody who's connected will get that message. So we have to wire up the emitters on the server side. We also have to emit the event listeners on the client side. They both have uh, a client socket and a server socket, and you have this channel between the two. So that's what we're trying to do. So if we close that out and we go and look at the server, on the socket, the client, we set up 3 new listeners: private welcome, private exit, and private message sent. And again, when that is emitted from the backend server, it broadcasts it up either to everybody or to the one client itself. I'm going to capture it, and I'm going to console log, welcome to the private chat, users left the private chat, and private message received. So we have the listeners, and then we just extend, we had some functions. So we have 3 new functions: join with a callback that emits join, again back down to the server. When you click the button, it's going to do this. These are the listeners up here from the server to respond, and this is the action for the client actions. So I'm emitting join, I'm emitting leave, and I'm emitting private send. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm wiring up 3 new buttons that will trigger the client side events, the user actions, right? When you click those buttons, it's going to call these methods that are going to emit back to the server. The server is going to capture them on these various listeners here, the join, the leave, and the send, and it's going to emit back up and broadcast to everybody connected, and then it's going to actually be caught on these listeners here. These three new listeners will capture that activity and console log it. And that's kind of how we created this little bit of a private chat on different channels. So what we covered today was how to use node.js as a networking tool, how to use socket.io, how to create a little mini chat across a general channel, and then we extended it a little bit to include rooms, so we could have a private chat across a private room. So that's a very basic implementation of socket.io. You can do a lot of great stuff with it. I love this library. You can do some gaming and stuff like that using phaser.io, and it's always a good little uh, topic for to talk discussion, and also for a project and those things like that. So that's all I got for today. So thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next topic, the next lecture. Thanks.